Welcome to the Inside the Box podcast, brought to you by Black Box Investigations and Appen Media Group. Dive into local issues important to the North Atlanta community, from politics and education to business and crime. Hear the story behind the story that you won't hear, read, or see anywhere else.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Inside the Box podcast. I'm your host, Hans Appen, and joining me on the show today is former Alpharetta City Councilman and current mayoral candidate Chris Owens. He talks to us about his history in Alpharetta and his journey to the Alpharetta City Council in 2008. He was also the last city councilman that served under both Mayor Arthur Letchas and Mayor David Belle. So we talk a little bit about the differences there. And then we talk about some of the current challenges and opportunities for the city and how he thinks he could address those as mayor. So it's a really interesting show. I learned a lot, and I think you will too. So thanks for tuning in, and here's the show. On the show today is, recently former city councilman Chris Owens, who is recently former because he's now running for mayor for Alpharetta. So, Chris, thanks for being on the show.
Hans, thanks for having me.
I'm interested to have you on the show for a lot of different reasons, but one of the things we've been talking about with guests recently is, at a local level, what politics is all about. I think it's interesting to hear from folks what made them want to get involved in politics, once some of the candidates that have been on the show, what surprised them, and things like that. One of the things I want to ask you about is sort of the balance between running for office, but then also being an elected official, and balancing that with your work life, with your family life, your church life, all the above. I know everybody has sort of a different way of going about doing that. What works well for you? How are you able to balance all of those things and run for mayor of a pretty large city in the South?
Well, Hans, I'd say balance is a key word. I have never had the opportunity to serve and run a campaign at the same time. So when I ran for office in 2009, I was new to the scene of community service in that regard. And then according to state law, we have to resign to be able to run. So I had to lay down my city council obligations and picked up my mayoral campaign obligations. So I've never had to do those both at the same time, like some people who were holding local office and running for higher office of that nature. But I say the key to balance is support from home. My wife, Jennifer, and the family have always been fantastic. When I decided to do this in 2009, they were supportive of me. Won't say it didn't cause some frustration and tension and tough to balance the schedule sometimes, but having that support is huge. There are times when you get out of balance. You go through phases where you have to focus on one thing more than the other. But right now, work life is in the mornings and early afternoons. Campaign life is in the late afternoons and evenings. And then family and everything else is in the late night and every other time.
Mm-hmm. And you're running in a special election. So I would think all of that's kind of to an extreme as well.
Well, it's a special election in that it's in May this year rather than a normal November timeframe, since we are in an even year election year. Mm-hmm. When Mayor Belle resigned to run for Secretary of State, he did put us in a special election cycle simply because he was midterm with the mayor's seat. So we are running for the balance of that term right now. But being in May and with the schedule triggering like it was, it's March, so he triggered that schedule in February in order to meet the 90-day requirement to get the mayor's seat and then subsequently the two council seats on the ballot in May, simultaneously, so that Alpharetta would have as short a period as possible with any change or a shortened or a smaller council.
Well, and I think it's interesting, too, to kind of look back at Mayor Belle campaign for mayor, because I want to say y'all probably announced around the same time. He may have even announced a little earlier, but he had until November to run. So his campaign is going to end up being a lot longer than the window of time you have to campaign for mayor.
I mean, when he ran for mayor back,
2008? No, 2011. I think it was 2011.
He did run a much longer campaign than that. when I ran for council in 2009, I announced in August and maybe mid-August, and we had the election in early November. And so that's similar to what we're doing now, which is we're doing like a 12-week, maybe a 3-month-ish formal cycle.
From what you've been able to see so far, what's different between having kind of that sprint to the finish instead of having that marathon race?
Well, it's really coordinating schedules. You know, Alpharetta hasn't gotten any smaller in the last 8 or 9 years. We didn't grow geographically, but there are more people living here than there were 8 or 9 years ago. So there's a lot of ground to cover if you're going to do grassroots, door-to-door campaigning. And then also it's a shortened schedule, so you have less time to do everything. So the last 8 weeks, we're scrambling around finding dates and times to be able to have meetings with people and get groups together for campaign purposes. So.
And we got some debates. We got 5, I think I saw.
Well, we got 2 scheduled. We've got yours that you suggested a date that we still got to work on that date, by the way.
Okay.
We can talk about that today. And then I've heard of 2 or 3 others that are interested but have not come forward with any offers for dates or locations yet.
Okay.
So we're open to those. We're just waiting for people to finalize any details they might want to
Sure.
out.
And for our listeners, we will keep you in tuned on those dates and locations and whatnot. I think it's a great opportunity for people in Alpharetta to get to meet the candidates and hear some of their positions on some of the topics that affect their lives. But whether you're listening to this podcast or you're reading our paper, we will have information on those debates. So some of those dates and times are up in the air, but we'll certainly keep you posted on that. So let's back up for a second and go back to sort of your history with Alpharetta. Let's talk a little bit about what brought you to Alpharetta. How long have you lived in Alpharetta? And then at what point in time did you start to get involved in the political scene?
Sure. You know, I grew up in Georgia, went to college over in Marietta, a little school called Southern Tech at the time. It's been renamed a couple of times and then most recently merged with Kennesaw State. But I found Alpharetta in 1994 when I graduated from college. Working for the city of Alpharetta was my first job.
Okay.
So my job was as a civil engineer, my job was to review construction drawings and go out in the field and do engineering inspections. And so back then, there was no Old Milton Parkway. And I'm not trying to say way back in the day because I know several people around Alpharetta that know it when it was much smaller than when I came here. But Old Milton Parkway was State Bridge Road, and it was 2 lanes. North Point Mall had just had the ribbon cut on it when I got here. And North Point Parkway was called East Side Drive and had not been completed all the way up to Windward at the time. West Side Drive was just a line on a map that people were thinking about. So
and Avalon was decades away from even being an idea.
2 decades away. You know, it was, there was a family that owned that property that was not interested in selling back then. The Windward community had just started to take off after all the planning effort that Mobile Land had put into that. So there were a lot of neighborhoods that exist today that weren't even an idea back then. And so quite a bit has changed. But we moved into Alpharetta in 2005. So I left the city, went into private practice, and Jennifer and I moved close to Alpharetta, but we found we were spending all our time in Alpharetta. So we joined Alpharetta Presbyterian in 99, right before William was born. And we found that we were spending all our time going to church with friends, eating and shopping here. And rather than drive back and forth, it was a 20-mile round trip from where we lived. So we moved into the city in 2005.
Okay.
But we were already involved in the community through the church with North Fulton Charities and some other people that we would meet after we got here.
Okay. When did you start thinking about running for city council?
That was a few steps away. You know, the first thing we were doing was just, getting involved at the church. I was asked to serve on session and was chair of the property committee right after the church added on the education wing, if you're familiar with that. That was the last big expansion there at Alpharetta Presbyterian. And so that experience also met Lionheart through my service as an elder. So as the property committee chairman, the church was technically the landlord for Lionheart. Lionheart used facilities there at APC, And that's where I met Mary Ulick and her team and staff. And they had basically outgrown what the church could do for them. And so they had a big step in their growth and in their history to deal with when they moved off the church campus and into their own building. So we got involved in that. It was just a natural thing to do. But I went to the Atlanta Regional Commission's Regional Leadership Institute seminar in 2008, and that really opened my eyes to the Atlanta area as a whole and how Alpharetta fit into that and what other people dealt with that maybe we take for granted and vice versa. And so with that combined with, this in 2009, was one of our previous council members decided not to run for re-election. John Munson had an open seat. And so I went and talked to a few people, talked to Jennifer first, and her first response was, no.
Not no, but hell no.
That's right. That's right. And I was persistent, a little bit hard-headed, she might say. And so we talked about it a little more. And I told her, I said, look, at the council, so back then Arthur Letchas was mayor, and Arthur was a retired school teacher and a football coach. D.C. Aiken was, and still is, a mortgage broker and a baseball coach. We had David Belle, who's an attorney, and we had Jim Payne, who was a retired salesman, and I think Doug Dorito was on council at the time. He was a tax advisor. I said, no one there has engineering or construction experience. And the recession was going on then. Mm-hmm. But I told Jennifer, I said, recession or no recession, Alpharetta has things that make the city work that my engineering background could help contribute and make a difference, make an impact. So I didn't run because I was mad about something or because I had an axe to grind. I ran because I really thought I could help Alpharetta be better. Mm-hmm. And so she got behind that, supported me, and so we filed and ran for office, and here we are.
You mentioned Mayor Letchas. Until you resigned recently to run for mayor, you were the last member that had served with both Mayor Letchas and Mayor Belle.
Right.
Talk to me a little bit about the different styles there.
Oh, wow. They're just two totally different people. They're both good men. I would say working with Arthur Letchas, he was very quiet, very reserved, and very much relied on David and Belle and Arthur were both similar in the fact they relied on staff to do their job. And this Alpharetta's got a fantastic team of people. Bob Regas is bar none the best and the finest city administrator I've met since I've been involved in city leadership. But Arthur was very much a reserved person, where David was much more outgoing and active and proactive. Not to say that Arthur didn't have his own motivation to do things, but they were very different in that regard, where David was very much had a vision and wanted to take Alpharetta in a certain direction, where Arthur had been here, grew up here his whole life. And he was very much a worker and looking out for the community. But he was not, as I'd say, as focused as David was when David got on the scene.
Okay. Is there a difference in approach also, given that Mayor Letchas, Alpharetta is his hometown, mm-hmm. and he's lived here forever, and David moved here. Is that something that we're not going to see much of anymore here in Alpharetta, or do you think that'll come back as families continue to raise their kids here? Well, sort of the homegrown candidate.
I hope we do. I mean, most of us are transplants. I mean, even though I grew up in Georgia, I'm in probably the second most rare minority. So the most rare one you find is that homegrown Alpharetta person who was born either here or I'd say the greater Alpharetta area, North Fulton, mm-hmm. and raised
down
here.
in Grady.
Yes, right. That's right. And raised here, or I guess the second most rare person is the native Atlantan, if you're looking for rare species, and then the third would be me as a native Georgian, because mm-hmm. a lot of people in Alpharetta are corporate transplants, mm-hmm. and they come from all over the country and all over the world. So, but I do hope we see that, because that's a huge aspect of a city that's grown like Alpharetta has over the last 35 years. is that corporate reload town feel that we have. I think we're going to start seeing that trend back to people that were born here because their parents came to work and their parents have stayed, therefore they're going to stay and hopefully raise their family here like you have. So that is something that I hope to see change, but it's going to take time because, those young people have to grow up and get focused on the community and decide to get involved.
And I agree. I do hope we see more of that. And one of the things I always find fascinating is to see where some of these kids who grew up in our, Alpharetta High School, Cambridge, Milton districts that go off to some incredible colleges and get incredible educations, but they don't come back. And it's always intriguing to me to find out why or what motivated them to go somewhere else rather than come back.
Yeah, I can say from a personal standpoint, I maybe 5 years ago, I could not have understood that. Our daughter is a senior at Kent State University. Our son is a senior at Milton High School. Both very different people, but having two children who are in that period of transition in their lives. I'll tell you one thing that is a blessing here in Alpharetta that we tend to overlook is I notice, and just through my own experience with my daughter, the world is the oyster for these kids. They can go pretty much where they choose to go. It's just much more, the world doesn't seem to be as big as it used to be when I grew up. And so I think that's an advantage, and it's causing kids in a good way to think bigger about the world and themselves, and causing them to be less reliant on, quote, coming back home. So in one way it's good that we're raising a generation of children who are more confident and feel more comfortable, I'd say, about going off to school and then finding an opportunity while they're there that might not lead directly back home. When I grew up, it was a big deal to go to, quote, Atlanta to go to college, and most people I grew up with did end up back home in North Georgia. So that's a trend that I broke, but it's becoming more and more common these days. So our daughter, when she left, she said she was definitely not coming back to Atlanta. Atlanta was not, quote, big enough for her, and she wanted to go to New York or Chicago or L.A. Or maybe even to Paris or London. She's studying fashion, and that's where the centers of fashion are when you are young and looking at that. When she got into college, she found out what she was interested in. A lot of great companies are based in mid-sized cities that have some fantastic quality of life, cost of living is good, and some great opportunity. So she has sort of backed off of that big city option right now, and she's looking at mid-sized cities that have some history and have some great up-and-coming things happening.
Is Atlanta back in the mix?
Atlanta's not back in the mix yet. I wish it were.
You're working on it?
The way Jennifer puts it is there's not a city that our daughter can pick that doesn't have an airport, and so we're just going to get frequent flyer mile memberships to whatever airline serves that city.
Okay.
So right now she's looking at Columbus, Ohio, and that opportunity might lead to Boston or somewhere else, but we don't know yet.
Okay. So one more question on the kids of Alpharetta, and then I want to jump back into the campaign. Mm-hmm. So one of the things we talked about on the last show with Councilman Ben Burnett, we started to have a conversation about, and we've since had some Twitter dialogue on. I'd love to get your take on, is the idea of where enrollment levels are at our schools in Alpharetta. There's some debate about whether they're overcrowded or whether we're seeing a decrease in school enrollment. And especially with our elementary schools, one of the things we were talking about was the idea that because home values are increasing so much in Alpharetta, that the elementary schools that are surrounding these neighborhoods are not in neighborhood districts that are going to be affordable for the late 20s, early 30s parents that have those elementary age school kids. So I'd love to know what your take is on kind of all that in general.
Well, I mean, first, you mentioned school enrollment, and I have heard comments regarding how the enrollment stands and whether schools are being overcrowded or whether they're not. Fulton County School Board, one thing I learned, and you mentioned earlier, we'll get to about what I've learned since I've been involved in public service. The city of Alpharetta doesn't have its own school system. We do rely on Fulton County schools to provide that. And we've got some of the greatest schools around. 4 out of the top 10 high schools in the state serve parts of Alpharetta. And that's not by accident. We've got great leadership at the schools for sure, but what I put a big reliance on or big expectation on that results in that is we got parent and family involvement in our schools like you've never seen in other places in the country. So that's a direct result of the investment that families make in the school system themselves, both of time and energy, that gives us that benefit. But you ask about enrollment, and there is a perception that enrollment is going up or that we're overcrowded, things like that. And I get that when as a parent, when I send my kid to a school and there are portable classrooms outside the school. And that's a job from the school board and the school administration I would not want to have. But what I have learned through my public service is they've got some great people working for the school system that hit their marks on school enrollment projections very, very closely, within 1% typically. And so what we've got going on system-wide, now we can all play with statistics and numbers and look at certain instances or specific cases. System-wide, the enrollment in Fulton County school systems has been flat or down over the last few years. But the school board just received a presentation from their enrollment staff, and these people, that's their job, is to do an enrollment projection study every year. So on March 13th, the school board received this presentation, and they look at previous year's trends, enrollment and demographic trends. They also look at their fiscal year forecast results and then look at future years. So they do a 5-year enrollment forecast. And so, talking about methodology in the school historic enrollment, but the enrollment peaked for Fulton County schools at around 96,000 students in the school year 2016-17. And that peak is not much more than the previous years, but this year, this 2017-18 year, it's down. And their 5-year projection shows a trend that's going to continue to go down. This is system-wide. Mm-hmm. And it's also North and South Fulton. Now, they do break those out separately. But I think where you'll see, to your point, you'll see some variations. There are a few high schools that are showing an increase in enrollment projection. But for the most part, the high schools and the middle schools, and especially the elementary schools, say the high school and middle schools are showing flat, and the elementary schools are showing a trend downward.
Do you make anything of that? Is that anything that we should make a particular note or be worried about?
Well, I think a couple of thoughts, and I say this, I don't have data to prove this, but it's worth a discussion and worth looking at. I have not discussed this with the enrollment staff at Fulton County Schools, and again, I'd like to, because they're very good at what they do. You don't hit these marks with the kind of accuracy they do without being able to see into the data. So I would love to hear their reaction to this. Anecdotally, myself, looking at it, one thing that we're seeing is the recession with home values caused people to be less mobile in selling and buying homes. So regardless of your financial situation, if your home value was down and you had a choice, you likely weren't going to sell when you felt like you were in a down market. So what we're seeing, and I see this myself, meeting people in the neighborhoods, walking door to door, as well as having group meetings, I'm seeing more and more people who are aging in place, so to speak. They're staying longer in their homes before they move on to retiring at the beach or going to the mountains or downsizing to be close to children that didn't stay here in town, right? So we're seeing that, and the recession, I think, caused people to be more comfortable staying in place longer.
So there's not as much turnover in neighborhoods that are feeding these schools.
Exactly. So I am seeing that. There are neighborhoods that I went and visited in 2009, and today, when I go back and visit those same neighborhoods, 9-10 years later, I'm seeing a lot of the same names and a lot of the same faces. And, they're everybody, just like me, they're all 10 years older, but they're still there and they're still enjoying Alpharetta and they still like living here. So the turnover is an issue that I see. Then, I'm using this label because that's what the media and what you read about, but I'm a little less inclined to whitewash everybody with this label, but the millennials. You've got a generation of people that either for financial reasons, personal reasons, or economy reasons, overall global economy reasons, are getting started later in life than they ever have. And so when you start later in life, you typically, I'm not saying millennials aren't home buyers, I'm not buying that story. I do think that they are thinking about home ownership differently than previous generations did, but they are also looking at
having children.
Yes, timing and quantity of children, and also what age they start having children. So we're seeing that. I think we're seeing that trend come out through the school system. Then you bring up the question of affordability for Alpharetta, and Alpharetta has long not been a starter home community. It's nothing new. So we all get a perception of what a starter home should be worth, and typically that starter home value perception is based in when you personally were looking for a starter home. And so the numbers are very different. I'm not a mortgage broker, but I do know generally what people say that you can afford in a mortgage based on the multiplier of your annual gross salary. We see more and more families being dual income families today than ever before, which does tend to give that advice that you can afford a more expensive home. Now, that's up to the individual family to make that decision. But yes, no doubt the price of housing is going up. I'm not going to deny that. But it costs the same. When I say sticks and bricks, it costs the same in materials and labor to build a home in Alpharetta as it does in North Forsyth or in Gwinnett or in Cherokee County. But the underlying land that home sits on and its value, I think, is what drives the overall cost of the housing and causes the housing market to be more expensive here.
All three things we talked about are variables in a free market economy.
That's right.
So even if the school system determined that it is an issue and it is something that needs to be addressed, I don't know what can any local or regional government do about that.
Yeah, and I hesitate, I'm not experienced with these policies, but I do hesitate when I see local governments trying to influence the market with incentives to cause housing prices to be lower, and by, say, artificially lower, whatever that number is. Let's say if your average home prices for easy math is $100,000 and you want to influence the home price down to $50,000, how do you do that, right? Is it the right place for government to be taking on that role? And I know some people would have very strong opinions of that on both sides. I'm not sure. I think Fulton County Schools, I certainly don't believe it's their problem. I think the school system's job is to educate children as efficiently as they can with as much love and compassion as they can. That's why they have data-driven people that look at these trends. So when they say schools are being overcrowded, or if school enrollment is down, whichever side of the coin we're on, it's the school system's job to adjust and provide the facilities needed for the population that they see coming and that they have. And it's a tough job. I respect them for that.
All right, well, let's circle back to the campaign. I want to know a little bit about what your decision process was like when you were deciding whether or not to step down to run for mayor.
That was interesting because I'll be honest, I had thought about serving as mayor at one point, but you never know when that point's going to be because you can't control what other people's decisions are and what timing does to those decisions. So I had considered it. I had talked to Jennifer about it, and that's what we mentioned earlier. That's really where all of our discussions come back to, is the kitchen table, if you will, for our family. But I did not expect David Belle to run for statewide office. And so that was a bit of a surprise to me. I'm happy for him for that decision, but was not something I expected. So in my mind, I was thinking, 2019. When he decided to explore that and it became viable for him, then suddenly I started thinking about it more. But again, even until, late December, early January, probably even January, I didn't even really know what that timing was going to be. We're always learning. we found out the state has special rules for local elections and a statewide election year, which dictated quite a bit of the decision-making process for David, which then trickled down to me. So, when I decided to run, I had been toying with the idea for a while, talking to people about it for about as long as what David was confident he was going to explore that seriously for himself, and was getting good response from people. So I've been looking at it, but what really made me decide to run when he stepped down is not, again, because like in 2009, I wasn't running because I was mad at something or had an axe to grind. I'm running because rather than trying to run to be the best mayor ever of Alpharetta, I'm really running to have a better Alpharetta through the mayor's office. Because in Alpharetta, the mayor's role and responsibility is to be a leader, a coordinator, and a cheerleader, is to get the council together. You might not all have the same opinion on every topic, and I think that's healthy, but you do that respectfully, and everybody rowing and pulling in the same direction takes the community forward. And we've got a great staff. They just need vision and direction.
I'm always interested to hear about what family members of folks who are running for office think about this. If you don't mind my asking, what concerns did anyone in your family have about it, and what was your response to them on that?
Well, we've had concerns discussed at home on a lot of fronts from everybody in the house. The biggest concern obviously is time commitment and what that means to us as a family. Also, that time commitment relates to the ability to commit to and have a structured work life. I have my own firm and consult with other people, so by nature of what I do, I have a flexible schedule, but that doesn't mean that I can just lay work down and walk away from it. Mm-hmm. So we have to balance that as well. We also, quite frankly, have had two discussions. One about the time commitment for service on the winning side of the discussion, if I win the race and become mayor. And we've also had the time commitment of the election itself and the campaign itself, how that is structured. Because certainly the campaign is requiring much more effort, in my opinion, than what the actual service will be. But nevertheless, we're running that with all the energy and excitement we have and that we can. But quite frankly, sometimes people aren't necessarily the nicest or at their best during a campaign. And so you run into people and opinions that you might not otherwise hear. And it's always good to hear opinions, but some of the discussion we had was, hopefully everybody would stay civil during the campaign and focus on the issues and campaign on that rather than some previous races we've had in Alpharetta. And it's been a while, but we've had some previous races, Hans, in your lifetime here that weren't necessarily civil or polite. And so, we did wonder about that and hope that wasn't part of the equation.
Are you committed to running a civil and clean race?
Absolutely. That's all we have done.
Okay.
We're focused on what our vision is for Alpharetta and what a great place Alpharetta is. And that's really all we're doing.
Another thing I'm always curious about is to what extent candidates and elected officials use social media to communicate with constituents, to get their message out, to be in the know of what's going on. And everybody uses social media to varying degrees. Talk to us a little bit about how you've been able to utilize social media, both as an elected official and now as a candidate for mayor.
Right. Well, rewind the clock again, just as for comparison's sake. In 2009, when I ran, everyone had a website. Everyone had a Facebook page. Twitter was not really on the scene then, or if it was, I don't remember it being a thing in 2009 as far as campaigning goes. But the Facebook page back then was very static. You put up information about yourself, and it was almost like a little mini website. And the websites were very static as well. Didn't have a lot of changes to them. It was really more kind of you had an intro page and an about page and an issues page and that kind of thing. But you fast forward through the last 8-9 years, and social media is a huge way for people to consume their information and become aware of what's going on and informed. But it also has generated, I think, in society, an impatience. People's say impatience, people's attention spans are much shorter than they used to be. So you've got to get a message out very concisely and very quickly, because they don't tend to, they move on. I mean, you think about your Twitter feed or your Facebook feed, it scrolls pretty fast. And so it's good for us. So it's been a really great tool to convey the message, show consistency in our message, but also keep people informed of events and other things and ways that they can get involved, because generally people do want to participate and get involved. We've seen a pretty good bit of excitement around that. So we use it. What I typically, as an elected official, have done before running for office is I would use Twitter, some Facebook more than not, to promote what the city's got going on or what's happening so that people can see that. And that's everything from upcoming events to decisions being made to letting everybody know that here recently a power pole fell down and blocked a roadway for a day and a half. And I know you guys put that stuff out. I saw that, yeah. But I do that as well, just basically to let people know. And, that example, I got several responses of people that, would have been sitting in traffic for an hour and they were able to just stay away from it. So, just keeping people informed generally of day-to-day things as well as bigger issues. I have not used it and don't intend to use it as a political platform, so to speak, to voice things like that, but keeping people informed mostly.
Okay. Another thing I wanted to ask you about as we look back at Alpharetta's growth over the years is just some of these developments that have emerged since you were first elected in 2009. And I'd like to hear about just sort of what life as an elected official in Alpharetta is like outside of city council meetings on Monday night. Because I think there's probably a perception that you all show up on Monday night, you do your meeting, and go home. And from what I can tell, that couldn't be further than the truth. So what sort of work do you do for the city outside of those Monday night meetings?
That's a great question, Hans. I tell you, a lot has been going on, say, the last 8 years. But again, in 2010, when I took office, we were still in a recession. And when Arthur was mayor, there were a lot of times we only had one meeting a month because we just didn't have enough items, business-wise or public hearing-wise, to warrant getting together and meeting. So we'd consolidate them all to one Monday.
How things have changed.
Yes, that's right. Now, I will say that as busy as things appear, that's all relative to the time frame during the recession when nothing was going on. Because if you rewind the clock prior to my being elected to council and even when prior to Arthur being elected mayor, there were marathon council meetings that would go till 2, 3 in the morning. And so that became routine back then. Well, during the recession, we took the opportunity to get a little smarter about how we ran public meetings. That was one thing that Arthur did as mayor, was he changed the way that staff presented items and timing-wise. So basically what we ended up doing was we would have more than one public hearing per month if needed, so that the public and applicants and the council could be at their best. I can tell you from personal experience, if you're taking up a new item of business at night after 10 p.m. at night, you're not getting the best part of me after having put in a full day of work and then start a meeting and you're 3-4 hours into a meeting. If it's a very important topic, really it deserves the time that it needs and the attention that you should put on it. So having multiple public hearing nights per month is something we changed so that we're not all sitting there half asleep and not paying attention. But outside of the city council chambers, a lot of work has to go into that. And I'll tell you, quite a bit of the development that's gone on here lately was in accordance with plans that were put into place in the late 80s to mid-90s and late 90s. A lot of the master planning and comp plans that were put into place and zonings that were done back then had just been sitting idle and not been realized until this economic cycle. So the number of hearings that we have as a percentage of what's going on is very minor. And so the work that goes in outside the council chambers, from my perspective, is a lot of these applications are very complex. They've got a lot of dimensions to them. It's not just a matter of, should you approve, 50 homes or 60 homes in a residential application, or, X square feet versus Y square feet in a commercial application. A lot of different things are affected by each other, interrelational items, and it takes work. You've got to read it. You've got to go talk to staff. You've got to do some homework. You've got to become informed, and I think that's what we're all elected to do, is to put in our best effort to understand it as much as we're capable, and then you make the best decision you can with all the information available.
So it sounds like a lot of it is you read a lot, you're talking with staff a lot, you're making sure you have all the information that you need before you make that decision on Monday night.
That's right. And so, my personal approach to it is, we would get the staff reports. A typical process for Alpharetta is an item comes before Planning Commission several weeks before the City Council sees it. And so I would get copies of those Planning Commission applications and packets. I would start reading on it then, if not even earlier, when staff gets the application in from the outside. You start reading on it, you watch and listen to the Planning Commission discussion, because typically we got a good Planning Commission, and not typically we do have a good Planning Commission, and typically their discussion will bring out thoughts and questions that maybe I didn't even think about. And so whether they get answered in that Planning Commission meeting or not, that causes me to think differently about something. Then I go do some more research. And once I feel like I've learned everything I can, if there's something that confuses me or I don't understand, I'm not beyond and above meeting with the applicant to get them to help me understand it, because they're the ones that are asking for it. And so if I can't figure it out on my own, I'm not a mind reader. If it's not obvious, then I want to go find out from the person involved is, why do they want it that way? What is their basis? Why are they asking for that? And so, yes, it's a lot of research, a lot of back and forth. And it's not all on my own. I've said before, we have good staff. They do a fantastic job, and it makes our job easier. But that doesn't mean that we just show up on Monday night and listen to the presentation and we've suddenly, quote, got it. It does take a lot of work.
Okay. So looking back throughout your time of service in Alpharetta, is there a highlight you can think of?
Well, I tell you, and I've talked to other people that have served in this capacity in city council or county commission capacity before as well. And it reminds me of how blessed we are in a city of Alpharetta. There's several highlights, and I'm not saying that because I can't choose. I mean, it's not often that you see and help a city build a new city hall. If a city hall is done correctly, that's a 50-plus year building. And the previous building we had, the city made a lot of good use out of a building that was built 50 years ago. The previous building had been added onto and renovated and things like that. As a matter of fact, I think that building, the previous City Hall building, was the first mixed-use building in Alpharetta. If you want to know about it, the Alpha Soda was in that building, and we had the city had office space for lease upstairs. So there was a real estate agent's office upstairs, an attorney's office. There were several businesses leasing space, and the city's actual use of that building was a very small percentage. There was a jail in the basement. And when I was elected council,
they don't make mixed use like that.
They don't make them like that anymore. They really don't. When the old hall got torn down, the jail cell bars were still in the basement.
Oh, wow.
And so that's where the IT department was when I was elected. Is they had servers and they had a couple of guys in the IT department whose their offices were inside a jail cell. So kind of put a different perspective on coming to work in the basement. But building that new city hall was a fantastic experience, and it was hard work. I was on the committee working with the construction team, seeing that project through. So it wasn't like we just showed up for the ribbon cutting and showed up for the groundbreaking. Several of us were involved throughout that. That was very rewarding. And I tell you, the Hotel and Convention Center, when Mayor Belle brought that up, I was probably the biggest critic of that concept, at least on council. Now, I can't speak outside of council. And David and I, that was his first, quote, big idea that he presented to council after he was elected mayor. And David and I did not see eye to eye on that project. But again, I mentioned earlier, is you don't have to agree with each other 100% to still get good things done. And so that disagreement really formed the basis of what I consider my relationship with David now. is, I didn't handle it as well as I could have, and we all grow and learn. But at the same time, my questions and his response and everybody around the whole group discussion helped that project become reality because of the way we were looking at it and looking out for what we all wanted was something that Alpharetta could be proud of, that the citizens could be protected from financially, and that would serve our community for a long time. And I think in the end, that's what we have. And it's a facility it's
beautiful.
It's extremely, extremely beautiful. Mm-hmm. The day they cut the ribbon on it, they had 90 weddings booked already. The day they cut the ribbon. As we were thinking about that issue, one of the things that one of my reservations about it was you can look at example after example of convention centers that are built without a plan. You just build them and expect economic activity to occur. And there are lots of communities in Georgia and across the country that built those things, and they've become a financial albatross to their communities because they were built hoping, build it and they will come. We did a good job of demonstrating the need, and with professional help, we dialed in the size of that facility such that we weren't going to be competing with other people in other markets. So we met the needs of Alpharetta in the right size, in the right place, in the right environment to do that. And there are financial safety nets underneath that protect the citizens from having to step up and pay for that. So it was not funded with what's called general obligation bond debt. It was funded with hotel motel tax dollars. And so, a GO bond shows up on mine and your property tax bills. The hotel motel tax dollars, if we rent a hotel room, we're contributing to that, or if our relatives do, but it comes from a much broader base. And logically that makes sense because the hotel revenue is what supports a convention center, and a convention center is what supports hotel revenue. Mm-hmm. So that seemed to make sense all the way around. But we also have a great partner in that as a public-private partnership, and so they accepted the financial responsibility for operating if the revenues don't meet what they need to. And then beyond that, if the revenues exceed a certain amount, then the city gets to share in that. So I think it's a win for everybody. So I'd say City Hall, the convention center are two big things, but I could go on about it. Fantastic things.
So on the flip side of things, any decisions or anything you can think you regret or would do differently?
Well, and I told someone this recently, I'm my own toughest critic. I rethink and second guess myself pretty regularly because not because I don't think we worked hard enough or looked at something long enough, but I always want to make sure we're doing the best we can for the city. So, a great example and it's I say a small example in the grand scheme of things, but in retrospect, it's a big issue, but not sure we got it right, is the whole glass recycling thing with our local trash pickup. And it's funny, we're talking about a 50-year plus facility for the city in a city hall, and hopefully that long and greater for the convention center. And then we're talking about something I'd redo as a decision on how to serve residential property owners with trash and recycling services. I don't know that there was any one good answer in that, but if I had to do it over again after we've seen it operate now for several months, I might take another look at that.
And that's a contract that renews, so we can take a look at it again in a future date.
That's right. It's a renewable contract, and also the vendor on that contract over the years had the contractual right to increase their cost, and they chose not to. And so, I consider them, if we needed to go back and renegotiate that or readjust it, I'm sure that we would be able to do that. I know we have the provision in the contract to do it, and I'm sure we'd have everybody at the table to talk about it. They are monitoring the use of that service, so we'll have real data to base that discussion on when it's time. But, individual zoning decisions, there's a lot of things that, we're not perfect. We don't have that crystal ball. You and I talked about all the work and preparation that goes into those decisions, but that doesn't mean at the end of the day they're perfect decisions. I met with some people out on the west side of town recently in the Providence-Mayfield area, and they've got a very strong opinion about a roundabout that got installed on Mayfield Road. And I'll be the first to admit that I think the roundabout was the right solution there to slow traffic and make it safer for the residents of that area. But what we missed is it's just the wrong size. It's too small, and it's got to be addressed.
It is a little snug.
And and again, you live and you learn. It is typical for private development to improve our infrastructure when they make an application and there's proven that their construction is going to impact. So it was very commonplace for the council to put a requirement on that applicant to build that roundabout. In hindsight, knowing that that was a residential home builder that we were putting that requirement on, I would have structured that agreement differently, because a residential home builder, although they do build streets and cul-de-sacs and things like that as a part of their neighborhood, a roundabout is not a typical residential street or cul-de-sac.
Yeah, you don't see too many roundabouts in neighborhoods.
Right. Again, in hindsight, I would not have taken away or taken back the roundabout. I would have made it bigger, and I would have been more creative about how to structure that such that a qualified roadway contractor built it rather than a home builder. I don't think the home builder is a bad person, and his contractors weren't bad people. They were just tasked to build something they had never built before. And so that's something we're going to have to go look at. If I'm elected, that I'll make that commitment right now. Is we'll take a look at that and make that better, because it can't get worse. It's a tough roundabout to go through, and I don't drive a very big vehicle. So yeah, there are a lot of things that we could look at and question ourselves on, and we should.
Okay,
because that's part of the learning process.
Sure. All right. So last question. My daughter's 3, and she will be going to Alpharetta schools, public schools. What is your vision for her Alpharetta when she's 10, 15, 20 years old? And what work would you do as mayor to make that vision a reality?
Well, Hans, like we talked before about the fact that I'm not really running to be the best mayor or have the best mayor's office for Alpharetta. I'm looking to have the best Alpharetta and use that office for that purpose. As an engineer, there are things underlying our day-to-day life that help us live in Alpharetta and enjoy our quality of life. And those are things just as common and everyday occurrence as roads and bridges, roundabouts, pipes, and other things like that. So we got behind on that during the recession. One way Alpharetta got through that was we did defer some maintenance, and we're catching up on it. We're not there yet, but we'll get there. So and my goal would be for her generation not to have to worry about those things, but to get us on solid footing so that those kinds of things are on autopilot, so that we can spend our time on the more important things for Alpharetta. We talked about the City Hall. We talked about the Hotel and Convention Center. You mentioned Avalon. That's exceeded everyone's expectations for what could have been on that old piece of property that didn't get started right before the recession. City Center. We've got a lot of cool things and exciting things going on, but we've got some gaps. And when I say gaps, what I want to focus on is filling those gaps, not with more things, but filling those gaps with our lives and our experiences and our time and our passion and energy. So we've got an example of that exceeded my expectation is Food Truck Thursday. I even went on record asking Kim Dodson, our special events coordinator, we had a hard time classifying that at first because we didn't have it written down, but to me, an annual event is pretty special. Something you do semi-annually is still special. Mm-hmm. When you start doing it every week for 9 months straight, at some point it crosses over the line, the threshold of being special to being routine. And so I predicted that the food trucks would run its course and would get people downtown, but I just expected people to get kind of bored with it and it to dwindle down maybe to a monthly thing or something like that if we were lucky. I tell you, that is the largest food truck event in Metro Atlanta is what I keep being told, and I love them.
Glad to be wrong on that one, right?
I'm happy to be wrong on that. That's fine. That was my prediction. But that's just one example of how our city is starving for things to put their arms around and build community around. We've got fantastic people here. We've got different people with different passions and different motivations for what they love to do. I think we're just starting to learn what music and entertainment can mean for Alpharetta on our terms. We've got a fantastic park. One of the things that we did with City Hall, we made a promise and we fulfilled that, was we've got a 5-acre park around City Hall. Now, what we promised was a 5-acre park in City Center. When it got done, with City Hall being nestled back in that park, it didn't take away from the 5 acres. It just caused the 5 acres to wrap around it. We've got a formal garden where you see people sitting in there reading all the time. You see people walking around. We've got a veterans memorial in there. I've since been approached by a veterans group that wants to add an additional memorial to that and increase that awareness for our community. But by and large, Brook Street Park is not being used very much. We've got a fantastic lawn and stage out there. Were you at the Mayor's Corporate Challenge this year? That opened my eyes like never before as to what could be done.
Tremendous potential for that park.
Holy cow. So for those that didn't make that or don't know what we're talking about, Hans, the Rotary Club of Alpharetta and the city put on an annual 5K and fun run, and it's always been centered around downtown and City Hall. Well, with that new park in place, it was staged out of the lawn. They used the bandstand for announcements and for the program. And they brought food trucks in and parked in the parallel spots on Haynes Bridge. And so it was all right there within easy walking distance of each other. You had teams and vendors setting up tents all over the park. And it was just an unbelievable energy out there.
Businesses, corporations from across Alpharetta bringing out their entire staff. Fiserv had 300 people out there that day.
We've got people.
LexisNexis,
Fiserv, and there were several folks who had previously committed to races annually down in Atlanta, in downtown Atlanta, that made comments that they're going to start focusing on this race because it was so much more fun and so much more intimate and nicer than having to travel all the way downtown to do their corporate event and also to support their charity of choice. So I was impressed that it wasn't, and it wasn't all just on the lawn. I mean, you gathered on the lawn, you went around City Hall to get started, you ran your 5K around over to Avalon and back, and then when you came back in, it ended in the parking lot of the library, and then you wandered your way back around to the lawn. So I would love to see more events like that, and by like that I mean community-focused events, something that could be as simple as a movie night on the lawn, and bring out families and bring your blankets and picnic baskets, or having acoustic concerts out there. I would love to see and
Alpharetta Unplugged.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That'd be fantastic. I would love to see. Maybe, and I haven't approached these people about it, so this is a fair warning if they overhear this podcast, maybe we can catch some interest. But have you been to the Velvet Note?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And they're in a strip shopping center on Old Milton Parkway, very small setting. They bring some fantastic top-notch acts. I'd love to see if we can't get them involved to help us program stuff like that and get some great music out there.
That'd be great, yeah.
Because we've had and focused on the west side of Main Street forever because that was our downtown. Well, now our downtown covers both sides of Main Street. And so I think that focus is going to have to broaden. We have to look at the bigger area and see what we can do. I'd love to have those events there, but I wouldn't stop it there. I'm just looking for ways to engage people and get people to embrace Alpharetta and love it, either for the first time or maybe love it all over again for a different reason.
Okay. I think that's a great place to leave it. The date of the election is?
May 22nd.
May 22nd.
Early voting starts April 30th and runs through May 18th, I believe.
All righty. So get out there and vote. Important to be part of the democratic process here in Alpharetta. And mayoral candidate Chris Owens, I want to thank you for being on the show and hope to have you again soon.
Thanks a lot, Hans.
This has been the Inside the Box podcast, North Atlanta's #1 local podcast. For bonus exclusive content, visit blackboxdocs.com. That's blackboxdocs.com. We welcome your feedback. Email us at pod@blackboxdocs.com.